jurisdictions might copy ideas that have worked in other countries. That's a form of scientific endeavor. It's of course not as rigorous as a double-blind medical experiment, for example, but it is a kind of testing. It isn't looking at a Bible and interpreting God's will and using that as an unchanging set of dogmatic principles to build your society and always harkening back to that. It's moving forward and testing different approaches and then finding what works best.
So, just a couple of things. All of those centuries when so much of law was based on the Ten Commandments, that was a terrible failure, I assume. But also, there's this notion of until the turn of the 20th century, Newtonian physics was held, if you'll forgive the pun, as being gospel true. If you taught anything other than in any good physics department at any university worth the name, well, you wouldn't be allowed to teach. But suddenly this little guy with odd hair comes along in Central Europe and changes, not gradually, fundamentally, the understanding of physics, of the way the world works, was changed by Einstein. All that went before apparently was wrong. So science is not constant, it changes.
Well, I think any society that you'd want to live in, any society that has existed, and in my opinion, some of the better societies have been in Western Europe and North America post-Enlightenment, have not followed the Ten Commandments. They've abandoned the Ten Commandments long ago. They really have not. Okay?
Thou shalt steal. Thou shalt
The first 5 of the Ten Commandments are all about how to worship God. I don't think those actually form foundational elements of our Constitution building, do they?
They do.
Yeah, they do.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I think in Canada, I want that side of the table.
Rabbi, please.
The Shabbat observance isn't compelled, so you're right, they haven't followed it.
But that's exactly it. That is a commandment that we don't follow.
Right. So, and that's a limit, obviously, that most societies have not compelled, meaning that where's the line between science and religion? Not that dichotomy actually exists. But every society picks, it's the religious impulse, start back over, the monastic impulse that might have been referred to before. Religion functions as a means on which to reflect on what our ultimate values are and how to make decisions. It's not, or at least not as I experience it, opening up a book, finding something, and then dogmatically holding to it. Are there individuals like that? Yes, and I'll join you in opposing them. Religion, as I experience it, is a way of finding out what the best is, what is godly, and using the collected wisdom of thousands of years. Our best minds for thousands of years have been working on this. What is godly? What is, given that we're here, what does God want from us? How do we best treat each other? And applying that in the world. And everyone does that, one way or the other. It's different from bad decisions like sentencing people to death for blasphemy to lesser ways of regulating speech, like banning Dire Straits from the radio for
We would call that a mortal sin.
Yeah.
You know?
And not that the two are really comparable, but it shows that everyone regulates in some way or another, and they base it on their values. And all societies have these values. We all have ways, and again, not discovered through science. Science doesn't tell us what's right and what's wrong in many senses. It doesn't tell us how to fall in love and what to love and everything like this. That comes from somewhere else.
Right. Just for the record, I was really only talking about Michael's comments that our societies are built on the Ten Commandments. I don't see that for the last few hundred years, and I don't see a disagreement coming from
Respect for something greater is it's the essence of those first parts, right? Of those first commandments that tend to revolve around religion. That there's something greater than you, and that level of humility. That's what those first commandments are about. And to the question of societies, all societies with strong identities have trouble dealing with people who are not part of that identity. It exists to a certain extent in modern Europe, where it's hard to determine what does it mean to be a French citizen to somebody who doesn't seem French, or to be a British citizen. And it's especially true right now in the Muslim world. All the countries that we discussed at the outset are majority Muslim. So it's a special issue there, and it takes on its own character there. And obviously one that makes the headlines more. But all societies deal with that. In North America, it's uniquely absent because I think in North America, our identities tend to be primarily the country that we're in. It's easy. Americanism encompasses a lot of things. I can be a good Jew and a good American, right? It's only when you're outside of that bound that you accept to have issues.
I would suggest that one of the things that religion, picking up on what the rabbi has said, brings to the discussion is something that perhaps since the Enlightenment has been definitely looked down the nose at, namely tradition. Tradition in the sense of wisdom. I think the problem is when you have clever people running the show. I would hate to be in a country where young people were leaders doing experimentation in an exclusive way. I would hate to see the parliament being a place where scientific papers are sort of interacted and read, and where different sort of thought experiments are worked out. I know, it's not good, but we can be rhetorically.
I'll hold you to that.
Yeah, very good. I think that wisdom, which is frankly what I think is lacking in terms of our educational approach nowadays. It's not a sense of drawing out the humanity of a person in order to see how they can live and interact in a culture in order to build something forward. It's now a process of credentialing people where they come to this place in order to buy a credential so that they can do what they think they can, some to serve a larger purpose, some to serve their bank account. And I think that latter thing is actually a very, very important dimension to keep in mind. Money and material goods and advancement dominate the imagination in many cultures, right? Of course, one wants to stay alive, one wants to be fed, but it can get unhinged and over-dominant in its way of absorbing people's attention. And one of the things that religion does, as the rabbi said, is it points us towards what is merely present, to sort of say, where does one stand in order to put this all together? Science is good at helping us discern what is present. And in the Middle Ages, remember, the medieval minds said there are two books that you have to read: the Bible and nature. And this is a Catholic thing, and if nature kind of contradicted what was going on in the Bible, well, you better start looking again at the Bible. Hence, we are not literalists in our reading of the Scripture, because these are the two ways in which the divine has been inscribed in them. So I think, if anything, religion gives us a sense of tradition and a focus on what is beautiful, what is true, what is good, and sort of opposes it against a lot of other things that are telling us what is beautiful, what is true, and what is good, and end up costing us a lot of money.
Sorry, I'm a professor. I can't resist seeing a piece of chalk and not drawing something on the board.
Do that. We'll watch Yaser drawing, and then we'll go to the next question.
The ABCs of correlating two things together. This is, if you say A and B go together, then you have to look at 4 boxes, not just one. Right? You have to look at when A is true and when it is false, and when B is true and when it is false. And only if this box is much bigger than the other 3 boxes can you legitimately say that A and B go together. Because we have the box of A but not B, and we have the box of B but not A. And the reason this is important to this discussion is because I just later take up 2 things that have been said and keep getting said sometimes. The attribution of certain types of violence or intolerance to one faith, right, which nowadays tends to happen with, my faith, Muslims. If not Muslims, then it's Muslim extremists. If it's not Muslim extremists, then at least it's Muslim majority countries, and those seem to be the problem. The problem with that, there's an analytical problem and there's a practical problem. The analytical problem is, in order to make that correlation, you have to look at a broader view of history, and you have to conclude that it's always been this way, that this problem has never happened when Islam was absent. And that's just historically not true. If this problem has been a recurrent problem throughout human history in all kinds of human societies, then it's not a problem with a particular theology. Now the flip side of this is this discussion about science. Science can be used in a very malevolent way. The claim that I am scientifically superior to you, whether in my use of the scientific method or my understanding based on scientific reality of what the world is about, that can be a very dangerous claim, and it led to very dire results in the first half of the 20th century in Europe. So, this is something we have to, William Shockley was a brilliant pioneer in electronics, was a professor at Stanford, was a firm believer in eugenics. And Stanford kept him on because he was this brilliant groundbreaker, and he brought in a lot of research dollars, and he taught a lot of good graduate students. And people just kind of were ashamed and embarrassed about the fact that you had this member of faculty who believed in this, racial, the scientific basis for just racism out and out. So we have to be very careful. I'm a firm believer in God. I'm a firm believer in that scientific inquiry, that the empirical method is the only legitimate way of investigating something that is a matter of physical empiricism. So something that I can touch and feel and smell, that's the only way of concluding something about. If you want to know the orbits of the planets, you have to look up in the skies and see which orbits they actually travel, rather than make convoluted arguments about heavenly bodies having to have perfect motion in circular orbits. This is a very simple belief, but I also believe that you can be a humble human being, respectful of others, even if you disagree with me on these two very core beliefs. And I think, for me as a believer of God, I see that as part of God's mercy. We don't actually have to get it right in order to survive, but we do have to go back to these fundamental human values. So if you're talking about enactment of laws, there is no recipe that we can program into a computer to generate good laws. But if we can agree on two things, and we will have to struggle as to what these two things mean, but if we can agree on these two things, then that's the beginning of the road. And the two things are, we have to have freedom. We cannot have things imposed on us. Therefore, there's got to be a majority rules of some kind. But two, we have to have dignity, so there has to be a protection for the minority. Right? You can't have a society that compels the majority unless it is compelling the majority to respect the rights of the minority. Right? You can't have a society that blows away the dignity of the minority because it is a minority. If you can balance these two things, that is in theology, in scientific discourse, in all decent human ideologies, whether they are divinely inspired or purely man-made, if these two things have to be the starting point for public policy.
Your point about science and eugenics actually is an extremely good one, because to avoid the accidental and the incidental, there is a concrete link between science and eugenics. This does not mean, it's basic philosophy, that everyone who embraces science embraces eugenics. But what it actually can see is that when eugenics became possible and fashionable in the 1890s, before then really science hadn't developed to the point where it could be achieved, the people who were promoting it, they weren't generally of the right to get on later, it was the left. It was H.G. Wells, the great popularizer of science, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the Fabian Society, great Tommy Douglas, of course, who believed in eugenics. But the socialism, scientific socialism, if you read often scientific socialism, because it's entirely scientific, and it wasn't so much about race, but it was entirely scientific, I suppose, to say, well, if someone is mentally handicapped, if they are physically handicapped, the expense, the possibility of risk, the idea of breeding, this is all very anti-scientific, because we want to improve the lot of the majority. This was the argument, for example, of H.G. Wells. It was enormously popular during his lifetime. If we really want to make the majority have a better life, we have to deal rather harshly and, important this, scientifically with the minority who may be damaging. And to indulge them may be religious, Wells argued, but it's not scientific. So it isn't an accident that science and eugenics were hand in hand between the 1890s right up until beyond the 1950s and 60s. It's been more of a moral imperative applied in the past 20 years, but today I see this renaissance of the idea of a world, a better world, where we never see a Down syndrome child again. That's a world we aspire to. Well, this is the argument of many people in science today. Why have a moral approach? Why an ethical approach when the science obviously is it's an open question, but it's certainly one worthy of debate. There was a gentleman here who...
I wonder if I can get a point in there. I'm just squeezing this stand. I'll be fine. I think there's an inconsistency here. If science isn't to be credited with all the progress and achievements and the good things that come out of society, I don't think we can so simplistically assign blame to science for example, eugenics. There are lots of scientists, all the way back to Darwin. There are quotes misattributed to Darwin that suggest that towards the end of his Origin of Species, he was looking to a future that involved eugenics favorably. Actually, people rarely use the full extent of that quote, where he's talking about how wouldn't it be crazy to, as human beings, keep alive the weak and that sort of thing, and that no animal species would do that. But then at the end, he actually says that's what makes human beings human, is that we do keep alive those who are not as fit in a biological sense.
It's too early. I'm talking about the eugenics movement.
Well, I'm sorry, but people often bring that up.
We
going all the way back to
nobody's
Darwin.
blaming science for anything. We're blaming scientists.
Well,
yes, if I may finish.
Some scientists.
If I may finish. There have always been. So let's talk about scientists. There have always been some scientists who have been pro-eugenics, but there's also been scientists who have pointed to this. Yes, who have pointed to science and said, properly understood, we want a diversity in the genetic code. We don't want to be taking out the.
Who were these people, say, between 1890 and 1925? I've studied this quite a bit. Who were the scientists who were saying no to eugenics? Because I don't know of many of them. What is interesting about it wasn't thought to be somehow extreme or perverse. It was generally accepted beyond science by, if you like, the chattering classes. But if you look at magazines like The New Statesman, for example, you look at left-wing editorials, you look at people like G.K. Chester and Hilaire Belloc.
Yes, but these weren't just scientists.
Well, you may object to their Catholicism, but they were exposing eugenics and other evils very early on, and it was, goodness sake, I hate mentioning Hitler and the Nazis in arguments. It's generally counterproductive. But the kill was used until the 1970s.
The point I'm making, Michael, is you said that it's a very quick jump to go from the science of evolution or the science of the human evolution to the idea that eugenics is a positive thing. All I'm saying is that there were scientists. There have always been scientists who have spoken based on the science that eugenics was to the detriment, never mind the ethical considerations, it was the physical detriment of the species. And if we look, for example, let's say the nuclear program, right? Scientists, yes, of course, were involved in developing nuclear weapons, but people like Einstein and Hans Bethe and other well-known quantum physicists, for example, and nuclear physicists have also pioneered disarmament and have spoken out against the horrors of nuclear war and that sort of thing.
But it's a simple observed fact that just as there are many, if you talk about Muslims and then try and attribute one opinion to all Muslims, it is meaningless, really. I mean, you look at, they display the spectrum of humanity. It's the same thing if you talk about scientists. It is a simple observed fact that just believing in the scientific method and learning it and pursuing it does not dictate your views on what should happen in society. It doesn't make you a liberal or conservative or libertarian.
No, I disagree with that. Yeah. So the Muslims and Islam are as different from each other as science and scientists. When science is used as an ideology, if we can, science tells us that the world will be far better off without certain people. It is religion that tells us the opposite.
It doesn't tell us.
My point was, and I asked you, who were the people arguing this when eugenics was popular?
I think as well, I'm telling you that there was the science of genetics, which suggests that you want a healthy diversity in the genetic code. So, and this, I'm not going to give you names, but this has been said by many scientists since the theory of evolution.
My suspicion, though, Justin, is with all due respect that you are one of the things that you commonly accuse us on the more sort of theistic end of the panel, and quite rightly about at times, is the tendency that you see of religious people to appeal outside of religion and get their ethics from there. Well, I think the boot is on the other foot at this point. I think what you're showing by your very reaction to eugenics is you are actually appealing to something greater than science that instinctively tells you eugenics is wrong. I put it to you that if science tomorrow discovered that, let's assume we decide the arbiter of science to be how happy and level of well-being of the human population. If we decided tomorrow, scientists unanimously just stood up tomorrow, never going to happen, but let's engage a thought experiment, and said if we removed everybody with autism, we could raise the overall well-being of the human population by 5%, I think you would actually have common humanity to stand up and go, no, there is something inherently wrong in that. I don't care who is saying it, there there is something inherently wrong in it. You are appealing outside science because science is not an arbiter, and you've simply proved that by your statement.
The first thing I said to this question was that science on its own cannot give us right from wrong, but that it's very informative in terms of understanding, for example, autism or some other medical condition. And understanding it, that's knowledge that is important.
We all agree.
Let's take this question.
We can talk free.
I guess I wanted to pick up on this idea of fundamental human values and the idea that, well, in Canada, we're an enlightened people and we can have these debates, and yet if the value that you're teaching your children, for example, like in Canada, we teach our children about plurality and the ability of individuals to rise up and do great things, and it's the power of an individual that can change the world. And so we're all well and good, but if you go to other countries in the world where they're teaching children different human values that are theologically motivated or theologically predicated, but are an anathema to an enlightened world. How does the world deal with situations like that? So I'll take as an example martyrdom. The idea that I should kill myself in order to, it's really an example of spite on a national level. It's that I'm willing to damage myself in order to kill more people of the opposite religion or political spectrum or whatever example you want to take. And that's an example of spite. But when you're teaching people martyrdom as a way of life, whose responsibility is it to, or is there responsibility to moderate that? To go in and say that that is an example of bad politics or bad governance. How do we, as an enlightened people, we see that in the world, is it our responsibility to do something about it as a country?
Well, I mean, just in the past couple of weeks, actually, there have been various examples, if you like, martyrdom. They haven't involved other people. I think there's been 5 different examples of people who tried to set fire to themselves. In Tunisia, in Egypt, I don't think one of them wasn't serious, and the man was burned, not particularly badly, but the idea that there were various reasons why. One man who lost a job, and in a way, G.K. Chesterton said, suicide is the greatest sin. When a man kills another man, he kills one man. When a man kills himself, as far as he is concerned, he wipes out the entire world. Now, I think we have to qualify that because suicide is often the act of such pain, of such agony. And I think we probably all know some people taking their own lives over the years, and you can only imagine the horror they're going through. Martyrdom is something different. It is, when we look at the examples in the Islamic world, which you're probably referring to, I think there's some very interesting sociology involved. Because quite often it's been people, young men invariably, who are often quite well-to-do, who are quite accomplished. And I think it's their sense of sin that they can simply expunge and remove all of this sin with a single act of martyrdom. Now, I don't know enough about the history of Islam to know whether this is a contemporary problem, and I suspect it is a fairly contemporary one. Martyrdom hasn't really a history in Christianity, that people have died for their faith, but killing others in that act, it actually is, within Palestinian society, again there are sociological reasons, but there aren't any Christian suicide bombers. There's someone who drove a suicide bomber to a venue, but it does run against the idea of what the human being is, and to take. There's a great line in the Inspector Lewis series, which I recommend to all of you, where the lapsed seminarian sergeant says about a suicide, yeah, we Catholics get pretty medieval about self-slaughter. The Catholic Church has very strong views on suicide because it's the taking of a life, and it's your life, but it's the taking of life, and it's God's to give and take. It is horribly anti-human. Nothing justifies it. People have suffered more than any of these causes that may have produced martyrs. People who came out of death camps where their families were murdered, slaughtered, did not become suicide bombers. Although there was one attempt, it wasn't a Jewish man, by a German socialist before the Second World War to be a suicide bomber and to kill Hitler. And it's extraordinary how many times that man escaped death, because in the mid-1930s there were many attempts and so close to getting him. It's very worrying. There is no justification at any time. I find the attempts at justification to be grotesque, sickening. It says far more about humanity than it does about any geopolitical struggle. It's the ultimate act of not saying yes, but of saying no. We can look into the reasons why it's developed. What do we do to contradict the culture that has produced some, not very many, but some people who act like this? I don't really know. I don't believe it's changing a regime. I don't believe it's a superior economy. It's rather like people who steal. They tend not to be the poorest. It's rather like soccer hooligans in the UK. They were never the poor. They were always people who worked in the city or in the army or something. Often crime, horror, is committed by people who are not provoked by desperation, but by something else. But there is no provocation for this, whether they kill themselves or whether they kill other people. And of course the nature of the beast, and it is a beast, is it will always kill the innocent, and often they're targeted only in the innocent. They're the easiest people to target. I'm not sure we in the West or we anywhere else will do about it. I'm sure there are many in the Islamic world who are very, very much against it. I'm sure that there's little or limited amount that they can do.
Okay, well let me start the ball rolling then, perhaps pass it. You look like you were about to say something, yes. That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking that, because I think that in one sense gets to a subject that we've danced around in various ways this evening. The whole question of, what is a human being? Is a human being simply something that can be described by science? Are we simply bags of chemicals? Are we a series of brain states that follow one after another? Or are we a network of relationships and those who we care about as what is a human being? And I think one of the answers that we've evolved here in the West, I think you were probably alluding to this, would be the whole issue of human rights and human rights theory, the idea that there are inalienable human rights that all of us share, no matter what religion, what country, what culture, what's the colour of our skin. It's interesting to look where some of modern human rights theory began to come out of. If you look back to World War II, I'm not going to mention Hitler. I just have, but never mind. But one of the things that came out of World War II was, of course, the Nuremberg trials. It was interesting that one of the appeals, one of the defences that SS officers tried in the Nuremberg trials made was to say we were simply following orders. The law of the land, and it's your duty as a citizen to follow the law of the land, told us that we should do what we did. And several of the Nuremberg judges made points, and this has been with us now to the present day, that there are certain rights and wrongs, there are certain standards of behaviour that transcend cultures. It doesn't matter what your government say. If Stephen Harper came out tomorrow and said that we should push every Muslim into Lake Ontario, it would be the right of every citizen to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that because there are human rights. But of course, human rights raises a fascinating question of where they're located. Sam Harris, to return to my favourite atheist, you can tell who I've been reading at bedtime of late. Harris discusses this beautifully. I mean, he said one of the problems with human rights, and he recognises this as an atheist and a secularist, is how you define the human. He said if you draw the circle too tightly, if you say it's perhaps the ability to dream and plan and have a future and to think and to reason, well, you exclude the handicapped. If you draw the circle too wide, you include great apes and perhaps all mammals, as Richard Dawkins would increasingly do with his emphasis on human rights. How do you define human rights and what it means to be human? And as one of my old philosophy professors put it nicely, he said, I'm not going to stand up and draw on the board because I'm not as artistic as so, but if you were to draw a great circle on the board behind me representing the whole range of DNA of every living thing on the planet, what human rights theorists would do is draw a circle within there representing the human and say that anything that lives inside the second circle, but not the first, enjoys human rights. But then, of course, the Aryan supremacist comes along. The white nationalist, white supremacist comes along and says, I will simply draw that circle slightly tighter and exclude the other. So the big question is how you define the human and who enjoys human rights. And of course, in the Christian tradition, the answer has always been to be human is to be created in the image of God who made us. And that's the theological answer to that question. But I think all of us have to answer that question. But you're pulling the mic that way, and yes, it looked like he was going to say something in that direction.
Briefly, so martyrdom, I also had a moment this week when I read of the self-immolations in Tunisia and now in other places, and I was just blown away. I couldn't believe it, because it's not something I associate with Islam. It's something I associate with Southeast Asia, with Buddhist monks in Vietnam. And there, that martyrdom gave them, it was a moral high ground martyrdom, right? It was that suicide raised the level of argument and made the oppressor seem like a greater oppressor, right? So martyrdom does take all of these different forms. I assume your question is to martyrdom where you're looking to take other folks with you, that's a whole nother ball of wax. And because we keep returning to World War II, in the Pacific, kamikaze pilots are obviously the example of some irreligious martyrdom, right? Or martyrdom not associated, certainly with Islam, but with service of the emperor, service of whatever Shinto, the ancestor worship that existed, but certainly not associated with that. And there's a society where, as they encourage that, there's no way to stop people from doing that. But the society had to change, and in that case, it was changed by force. For those who encourage that violent martyrdom, and one way to blunt it is to make it ineffective. I think people do it because it gets results in one way, and it's guerrilla warfare by another means. Instead of targeting a uniformed soldier, you target uniformed civilians, and if it gets results, it will be used as a form of warfare, and that's the basic fact of human interaction.
Thank you. I think that one of the difficulties we have in engaging other cultural forms across the world is that what we bring to it is, to use your language, Andy, is a very, very tightly drawn circle that basically encapsulates only the individual. There has been a swing, a proper creative swing from tribalism towards the individual. But then we've created this sort of fiction, as if somehow to be a human being is always and everywhere to fundamentally be yourself, as opposed over against others. It seems to me that the new kind of consciousness that, if you will, that the world is coming to, and I'm not so sure that globalization does it. I think globalization makes people neighbors. But are we going to be neighbors like individuals? Have you ever watched 2-year-olds play? They play side by side, but they never play together. See, one of the things that Buber and Levinas taught me is that it is in the glance of the other that we discover our own kind of being, who we are. But yet we're not just our discovery, our history. We are a what? We are a bag of cells. That's really important. We're this particular kind of bag of cells with a history. And those two things come together. And we're a bag of cells that never exist always alone. We're always in community with other people. And I think this is a very, very hard kind of job. The easiest way to deal with martyrs is to, if I might use my language, is to use Satan to cast out Satan. Jesus at a certain point in the Gospel of Mark is accused of being the realm of Beelzebul. And he says, well, can Satan be used to cast out Satan? In other words, and the answer, I think, profoundly is most often that's what we try and do. We use violence to cast out violence. And somehow in my tradition, the response to martyrdom in this sort of destructive way, perhaps it sounds irrational, but I think it has a deeper kind of rationality. It's simply that of kind of the witness of love, of witness of loving community, a witness of living, loving community. And that I think is the kind of growth that I hope globalization is moving us towards, is a sense not of just being neighbors with the planet, with other people, with God, but actually being, sisters and brothers with the planet, with other people. And once we move to that and break apart those sort of structures of violence that push that apart, something new can emerge. I just wonder if our individualism just imaginatively doesn't let us go there. And which is why I think religion at its best, and science, scientific reflection, ciencia in its best, really invites us into a larger perspective.
I think so. One of the challenges I have as an engineer is I tend to think in a very abstract way, and on an issue like this, where a lot of emotions and a lot of personal pain, that is just not appropriate. So that's a challenge that I have to grapple with. And so forgive me if I take this a little bit slowly. If you look at what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt, that's a very different scenario from some of the other examples that come to mind with this question, because I don't think any of these people, certainly the fellow in Tunisia and probably the people in Egypt, and you have to imagine, the way that I felt this morning when I woke up and I saw in my email this note from a colleague that in the last 24 hours, 3 people in Egypt have just set themselves on fire in front of the People's Assembly. And it's just, it's very difficult to describe that feeling in words. These are not people that are trying to trigger or do anything in particular. These are people that have just, exactly. Particularly the fellow in Tunis. He just walked out of a place where he had been, it wasn't just about the loss of a job, he had been personally and deeply humiliated. And this is someone walking out and basically has no self-value left, does not understand where to go from here. And he turns around and he does something like this. That's a very different situation from some of the other things that we're talking about. If we talk, for example, about, and I think, David, that's possibly one of the things you're talking about is the conflict in Israel and Palestine. We do, as difficult as it is for all of us, I think we have to step back and recognize that human societies where martyrdom is not considered a noble thing are very few and far between. Martyrdom is to sacrifice oneself for something that is supremely noble. And people do it in all different forms. The firefighters that ran into the towers, the World Trade Center towers, to try and save people, knowing full well that they were running into grave danger and probably were not going to come back out. And those people are martyrs. And that is something that is noble. The Canadian soldiers that died in World War I and in World War II, we look at those people and we value and celebrate their sacrifice. So the question isn't whether you're going to die. The real question is, a number of questions, but why are you going to die? And B, what else are you doing in the process of dying? I think Dan hit the nail on the head. It's a question of not that you're taking your own life, it's that you're trying to take other people's lives with you. Suicide, we can talk about suicide from a sociological perspective, from a theological perspective, from a human perspective. And as much as we're shocked about it, in the context of what we're talking about, suicide is a red herring. The issue here is not that people are killing themselves, it's that people are killing other people. And that's the question we have to grapple with. And in the context of many conflicts, people find it all too easy to justify the killing of someone on the other side, quote unquote, whatever that other side may be. Unfortunately, we also know from human experience that people go to war sometimes because they have to, and we wind up killing each other. And that again has cut across different societies and different races and different religions. At some point, people do that. So the distinction becomes very important of when am I waging a legitimate struggle of some form, and when am I just murdering other people. And so if we were to look at any of these societies, whether Muslim or Southeast Asia or Japan or wherever you go, where people do this, people do not ask whether martyrdom is a good thing or a bad thing. People ask, if I were to go and do this action and die in the process, is that martyrdom? And those are the kinds of discussions we have to have full on. And we have to talk about the struggles that are going on. And it's not easy. It is not easy at all to talk about these struggles and to talk about the people that die and to talk about the pain that is inflicted. But again, we have to push ourselves. I'm not claiming I have all the answers, but we have to start by pushing ourselves and then to push everyone else around us in our communities and beyond our communities, that there is no justification for killing an innocent person just because you're angry. Whatever the basis of anger, whatever the foundation of anger, if it leads you to kill innocent people, you are wrong and you are committing the greatest sin, whether you believe in a religion, in any theology that I have been able to examine. Murder is the greatest sin, or whether you do not believe in a formal theology and you just believe in humanity, murder still is the greatest sin.
I would get rid of the innocent too. I just think killing people is just wrong.
It's sort of, again, in these, one has an organizing view of it, right? Societies tend to view their defense of their sacred values of their land as worth killing for. And we've stumbled into this way of organizing it that is done, that would be properly done by uniformed people to uniformed people. Those other people are supposed to kill each other. It's the spilling over into the civilian population that, specifically in the issue that we're sort of dancing around, the Palestinian view tends to be Israeli, that Palestinian deaths at the hand of the Israeli army are not justified. The Israeli side of the argument tends to be, but they are justified because they're done in the defense of these principles and this security principle. And in the other direction, the suicide bombers are justifying themselves by, this is getting us closer to our state. And the other, and the side is that no, this is just merely the wanton slaughter of innocents. And I say that having spent, my children were born in Jerusalem, there were repeated explosions of buses around our neighborhood. So it's something that's real, but it is something that is almost less on, it's how one frames the argument and what that meta-narrative is. And I would say the ideal, my understanding of the meta-narrative since scripture has been quoted is in the middle of the Torah, in the central book of the Torah. In Leviticus, it says, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, which Jesus quotes as one of his favorite lines in the Torah. You should love your neighbor as yourself. And in the Talmud and then in Rashi, the great medieval commentator on the Torah, there's a short comment that says, Rabbi Akiva omer zeh klal gadol b'Torah. The great sage Akiva says that this is the organizing principle of the Torah. The great organizing principle, meaning that every other law in Judaism has to be understood through the lens of love your neighbor as yourself. So there's a lot of laws in the Torah. We can quote some of the ones that we don't like here, right? There's ones on killing, there's ones on genocide, there's one that all religions, all philosophies have this. It's all in sort of where you favor and what you organize around. And what we're supposed to organize around is how is the other feeling? What is the best balance of serving not just my interest and my understanding of what's godly, but how is the other person allowed to exist in his or her own space as well?
If I may, I'm glad we've kind of come back to something we started with, this idea of expanding the circle of humanity, the circle of protection by treating others the way we want to be treated, which I think is definitely in most, if not all religions, and I think we can agree in many secular philosophical schools of thought that are contemporaneous with many of the origins of the faiths that are being represented tonight. I think a lot of this conversation was certainly started on a rather pessimistic note, and I think much of this thread has been pessimistic. I want to give some hope. I think that new ways of looking at the world, and in fact new technologies have a part to play and are showing a positive contribution to expanding that circle. We have social networking, we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have blogs. You can experience in some way what it's like to live in some of these exotic foreign lands. Of course, it's not totally accurate, but it's far better than anything we've been able to experience before. Anybody, pretty much, as long as they have access to the internet, can have a blog. And not everybody has that access, but it's much more democratizing, that ability to share your life story than it has been in the past by far. And I think that's going to help expanding that circle of common protection and common humanity. And as one example, and I'm sure there's many, take the case of Sakineh Ashtiani, a Muslim woman in Iran who was sentenced to death by stoning for adultery. Well, there was a huge international movement, which was obviously Western countries played a part in that, but so did Middle Eastern countries that mobilized and that have successfully, through blogs and through online social networking and technologies of that sort, but of course fueled by the ethics of human decency and human compassion, have been able to keep her from being executed. I'm not sure if she's been let off completely, but that's at least positive for now, and there's many other examples of that. So I do think that there is both cause for cautious optimism and also a part that those of us in the West and in other parts of the world can play in terms of bringing our understanding of human rights and social progress to the four corners of the world.
There are half a dozen people with their hands up. We've reached 9 o'clock, and it wouldn't be fair to have a question and just give you a moment. I'm sure we're going to hang around for a while. I want to come and chat. I think that was a success. Was it? I'm sure we can do it again at some point.
So Justin has something to say about that.
Oh, please, yes.
Yeah, well, my proposal is that the Cordobahouse was very generous in terms of both pioneering this concept and hosting successfully, I believe, this first event. I am proposing that we circulate this idea of a rather unique Michael Coren show-esque version of interfaith dialogue among the various institutions and nonprofits that I think many of us represent, and I'm putting my hat in the ring and proposing that the Center for Inquiry, where I hail as the director there, it's a humanist, as I was saying earlier, a secularist organization, but we love to talk about both secular and religious perspectives on questions of ethics and social political issues, and we have gone out there on a limb and we've stuck our necks out, and I'm sorry we didn't get to talk much about this. This is one of my big issues. I think the big issue for all of us is the idea of engaging in the public square, and in particular in the university setting. I'm sorry we didn't touch on this because this is a university setting, in terms of my personal belief that religion does have an important part to play in that dialogue, and I don't believe in censoring it pretty much at all, and I think, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, I think most of us would agree at least on that. And so I'm proposing that the Center for Inquiry, maybe at the University of Toronto, near where we're located, host the next of these panels. If everybody is game with that, we can figure out a date.
We've got 3 cities represented between us, we can circulate between these.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of the organisation. It's taken a lot of work to achieve this. It's a horrible night out there. Thank you guys for coming out in this awful weather. And have a wonderful evening. Be safe in the future. I hope we come out of this with a more of an understanding of each other, and also a certain knowledge that the only true path to salvation is the Roman Catholic Church. Thank you and good night.